we saw you up there on stage, as convincing a representation of, how Beowulf would have been performed, in the Middle Ages, as I can imagine seeing in these days. But my question to you is what you did actually possible, so to speak? Can you really reconstruct the way the techniques that a bard would have used? What kind of information do we actually have to know about that sort of thing?
It's a long process, of course. On the one hand, very simple, and on the other hand, very complex. The simple part of it is that we know for a fact that there were people, usually men, who had the position in their society, which would have been a tribal society or into early Christianity, who had the function in their society of telling stories, of singing about the old rulers, about the heroes of yesteryear. And indeed, these men were the memory of their people. They're the ones who knew everything about the identity of the tribe, who had been a ruler, what battles had been won. We have to remember this is a pre-literate society with no written records of any kind, no written language of any kind. And so this oral poet, this person who has memorized and learned a great deal of text, is really essential. So we know it was a human being, that he had two hands, that he had a voice, that he was able to communicate with his listeners and tell not only old stories like Beowulf, or stories of entertaining nature, of ennobling nature, but also information, genealogies, important events in the life of the people. And then later, as Christianity was introduced, the heroic aspect was transferred onto the saints. And then you would have saints' lives told very much in the same way that the heroic epics were recited, or even the Gospels at some point were translated into vernacular in a way that storytelling was known in Germanic society. So that part of it is relatively simple. We know from descriptions in the text, also in Beowulf, that an instrument played an important role in this function, this singer of tales, and his function in society. And very, very often we see depictions, or we read depictions of some kind of plucked stringed instrument. It's sometimes called a lyre by archaeologists or others, but I prefer to call it a harp, since that's what they called it then. The harp is a Germanic word. That's the way it was used in Old English, in Old High German, in Old Icelandic. The word was always some derivative of harpa. And this instrument had a real function, which was that it provided some kind of musical information to the singer or the teller. And it also had a symbolic function, because the person holding that instrument in his hands was then clearly the person with that role in society. And it was kind of a symbol of the power of words, the power of text, the power of listening to stories and language. So it only remained for me, once I reached this decision to try it, to solve a couple of problems that are fairly solvable. One of them is, what role did that instrument play? How was it built? And especially, how was it tuned? That was the crux of the whole thing, because for a musician, of course, the tuning of an instrument is going to be very determining in all that will follow. So that was an elaborate process, and it's an ongoing project. I can't say I found the answer, but I found numerous possible answers, which are all somehow similar, and yet they vary in details. But clearly, this instrument had a tuning. It was tuned according to some kind of system, and at that moment, you can really also benefit from our knowledge of medieval music, how medieval people felt and perceived tones and how they interact with one another. And that gets into also the confrontation of pagan society with the coming of Christianity in the early centuries. So that's an interesting confluence, because we have there the end of an oral culture going into written culture, and we also have the end of a pagan culture, which is becoming a Christian culture. So it's a very interesting time for music, for stories, for instruments, and for the use of the human voice in a non-liturgical function.